a biblical perspective on life, culture, and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, let's turn our attention to how we think of those bad things that can sometimes take us off guard, even derail us from the things that we feel like we're called to do by God. Those things where we see in others, perhaps even the sort of tragedy that takes a life too early, or that there's a career change, not by your choice, even the fact that sometimes people lose their jobs, and, you know, what higher purpose, what higher meaning could there be in all of that? Well, Bill Muehlenberg's been thinking through some issues this week on turning tragedy into triumph. Hello, Bill. Welcome back to 2020.
Good to be with you again, Neil.
Hey, Bill, tragedy into triumph. We might be saying, is there something special that has led you to be writing about these things this week? That's something that perhaps some listeners might be thinking, because you're a prolific article writer. And, where does the inspiration for some of these come from?
Yeah, well, it's often the case, actually, that, what some people might call coincidences, we might really call God incidences, right? Sometimes 2 or 3 things will just happen all at the same time. The other morning, I had 3 things seemingly separate, different, but then all of a sudden I thought, wow, these 3 things really go together. Ended up writing an article on it. So it began in this case with simply a morning Bible reading, book of Isaiah, chapter 25. That passage that speaks about how God will swallow up death forever. He'll wipe away tears from our eyes. Many Christians know that from the version in Revelation that quotes from Isaiah. So that was the first thing that morning. Then on social media, I noticed that, it's been 43 years exactly since we mourned the loss of the great Keith Green, the Christian musician. And at the same time, I got an email. So again, all 3 on the same hour from an American Christian ministry saying, can you give me contact details for an Australian who's been suffering persecution? So I sent them the details and they got in touch. And the piece ended up being on all 3, looking at that passage, looking at Keith Green and what seemed to be his untimely death, and then looking at this Australian doctor, Gareth Koch, who lost his job about 6 years ago simply because as a Christian, he would sometimes in his spare time talk about, abortion or the trans agenda and so on. And for that, he was given the flick. And just this past week, finally, after 6 years of waiting, a decision was handed down in his case. And basically, a few things he was cleared of, but basically they still found him guilty. So anyways, I tied all these things into, does God have bigger purposes? Things we may not see at the time, but God can work for the good.
Well, let's talk about some of those, these sorts of issues. The Gareth Koch issue we've been talking about a little earlier this week. And, here he was, a Christian doctor, and dredging through his social media back to 2019. And as you say, he's been really left high and dry. His career is over. His livelihood is no longer able to be earned as a doctor. And when you mention Keith Green, this might be a long time ago, but here he was in a flourishing music career, touring the world, and in some sense, some say, he was sort of taken prematurely, a young man who died in a plane crash. How does God allow those bad things to happen to good people, and is there some sort of a special purpose he has in that? If you're talking about bad things happening out of these tragedies, or these tragedies being turned to good, how do you reflect on it?
Yeah, well, it's always hard, obviously, and you're in the midst of this. Obviously for the doctor, I know him, Christian friend here. Right, never had any complaints. Everybody loved him as a doctor. And then all of a sudden to find he's been suspended, for simply writing in his own personal time things on ethical and social issues. They didn't like that, so they penalized him for it. So he's been out of work ever since. He's actually had to find another career, take up a whole new different job path to keep his family fed. So obviously at the time you think, boy, this is terrible. And it was. It was bad for him. It's bad for freedom and free speech. But as I wrote in my piece, well, by now, of course, he's 6 years on. He's realizing he's probably never going to get back to being a doctor. But the point is there's others here in Australia and overseas who also have been treated like this. So if nothing else, his bravery, his courage, his refusal to recant, right? His refusal to bow down and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I never should have said any of this." He stuck by his guns. He, said, "Hey, as a Christian, I have a right to speak biblical truth in my spare time. I've never done this during my practice, never had any complaints, even from homosexual patients." So just his testimony, I think, is going to help stiffen the spines of others, give hope to others, because this kind of persecution will continue to ramp up. So it sure didn't look like good news, certainly to him and his family 6 years ago. But now, looking back, even he can see, as I wrote in my piece, well, maybe there is a silver lining here. God can use this. At the time, it seemed terrible, end of the world kind of stuff. How do I feed my family? Now he's surviving. We took out a crowdfunding thing to help him along the way, which helped pay for the Christian legal team, Human Rights Law Association, that's been helping him with this case. Sadly, we didn't quite get the results we wanted. But again, God can use this, turn it around for good. So at the time when you go through a tough thing like this, it seems like God is nowhere to be found. But sometimes with hindsight, or at least certainly in the next life, we'll see, hey, God was there all along. God had perhaps some higher purposes in mind that we couldn't see. And for that, we really need to keep trusting God and believing God that whatever the circumstances around us, God's still there and he's still calling the shots.
A lot of people feeling what you might term even a light form of persecution, losing your job. I mean, that's not the same as being executed, burned at the stake, losing your head, being lynched from a tree. Those sorts of things have marked the Christian church through the years too. The martyrdom of the apostles, or if we think of Stephen being stoned there at the hand of Saul before his calling to a level of apostleship. But the good that we might see out of the martyrdom of the saints. And these modern forms that we're seeing in Australia, there's some cancel culture and some people losing certain levels of respect and, their livelihoods. How do we align all that, Bill, with what God might be doing?
Yeah, again, trying to see the bigger picture, get his perspective, as you say, overseas right now and throughout history. A lot of Christians have paid a much bigger price. It's one thing to lose a job, as you say, but martyrdom has been a key part of the Christian experience for 2,000 years. I think it was Tertullian who said that, when the blood of the martyrs is being spilled, well, that becomes the seed of the church, right? It helps to, as horrible as it is, it really helps in the sense for the church to grow when people see, wow, these guys mean business. All the early disciples, right? They, most of them were put to death as well, and yet it resulted in the worldwide spread of Christianity. So again, never fun at the moment, whether job persecution, other kinds of, just people making fun of you, or all the way to being put to death. It's horrible. But God can use it to do much greater things for the greater good. So it's keeping that in mind. And again, somebody like Jareth Koch can now see that, hard as it was back then. He can see, well, God's got his hand in it. He's remaining faithful. He didn't give up his faith. He didn't yell at God and say, why did you allow this to happen? He trusted throughout. And as I say, I got this American group now got in contact with him. So his story is going viral. It's going global. American ministries and others are wanting to talk about Jareth and his story. So again, wasn't fun for him 6 years ago, but if God can use it now for believers around the world, well, that's pretty good. We can deal with that.
Is this the typical thing you think happens where believers are strengthened, emboldened, encouraged when someone goes through some testing and some persecution, even the loss of their lives, as we say with regard to those martyrs? Is this something of God's higher purpose, the way that he's done things even down through history, even into Old Testament times, where the blood of the martyrs cries out and it encourages? I mean, I'm even thinking of Cain and Abel. I mean, there's lots of different stories, aren't there?
Yeah, well, plenty throughout church history, and as you say, in the Bible. So again, Keith Green, like I say, this week, 43 years ago, exactly this week, when he did go down in that plane crash in Texas, just 28 years of age. Two of his children were on board. The whole world, Christian world, when they learned of this, were in shock. We had, my wife had actually chatted with Keith Green when we were missionaries in Europe, and amazing ministry, as you know, the records he produced, the songs that he wrote, very heart for evangelism, a heart for God. And there he was, taken at 28. But today, right, he would be just as popular as ever, maybe more so. So even though dead, yet he still speaks, to kind of paraphrase Hebrews 11. His testimony goes on. In fact, who knows? Maybe it's a greater testimony today. Certainly his wife, right? Kept the ministry going, Last Days Ministries, and remaining kids, and she's still serving the Lord. So as horrible as that was, that plane crash, perhaps God is being glorified now even more. There's more people being reached, and his music continues to be shared around the world. Even for a while there, Bob Dylan, I believe, had played on some of the early Keith Green albums, and maybe even Keith, I think, helped out when Bob Dylan had his kind of Christian phase, and he played on some of his albums back in the late or early 80s. So you just don't know what kind of impact, what kind of testimony you can have. So, it's the same Genesis 50:20 story, right, where Joseph tells his brothers, you guys, you meant it to me for evil, but God meant it to me for good. So whether being fired from a job or even, God forbid, a kind of premature death, although in God's eyes, I suppose you would say there is no premature death. He knows our days, they're numbered, and for his purposes, which we may not now understand fully, we go to be with him when he calls us to go home. So we have to have faith. We have to have trust. We got to keep going, even when it seems like, where is God in all this?
Well, Bill, you remind us that there are stories that take us right back into Old Testament times and into New Testament times. The early church fathers, the martyrs who've gone before, and now even just thinking through issues of persecution of believers. And I guess you'd have to put the Jareth Koch story into a sort of a persecution there, losing his livelihood over something that didn't affect a single patient, but there's a certain big brother element to it. And the way that God uses those things, and we can be encouraged, I think, that God has done incredible things because of tragedy and because of loss in the past. And perhaps there's more of that coming as things heat up for the future. I'll point listeners to the article we're talking about today. It's called Turning Tragedy into Triumph. You'll be able to find that when you visit Bill Muehlenberg's website, billmuehlenberg.com, or simply Google Culture Watch, one word. Hey, Bill, thanks so much for another update today on 2020.
Thanks again.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.